Chapter 29. Kyler was back in the city on his way to the one safe house he was confident hadn't been discovered during the God King's reign when the Kakari spoke. Would you be excited about Logan being king if he told you politics is the art of the possible and asked you to murder his rivals? I'm already damned. My crimes might as well accomplish something. So you'll serve clean water out of a filthy cup. You must have better tricks than I do. The safe house was on the east side, far enough from the fashionable areas that it had been on the city's outskirts. Now the building was gone. The entrance itself, a flagstone set flush with the ground, was only paces from the God King's new wall. The neighborhood, once unfashionable, was buzzing with activity. After the God King's death, thousands of people had fled the Warrens, either hoping to reclaim their lives or hoping to claim someone else's better life. The fires that the displaced had started on their way out of the city had left great swaths of it bare and black. Too few buildings remained to shelter everyone, even without the thousands who had left the city with Tara Grayson. Now they were all back, and there were no building materials to be found. With an army besieging the city and cold rain starting, people were desperate. Kyler sat with his back to the wall to listen to the tones of the city. There was no way he was going to get into the safe house before nightfall. Even invisible, he couldn't lift a flagstone in the middle of what was now a de facto street without dozens of people noticing. The safe house had another entrance, of course. Unfortunately, a new wall was sitting on it. The gossip was angry. Tara Grayson had stopped the free flow of traffic across the Vanden Bridge this morning, and it had nearly caused a riot. Kyler listened to a proclamation that promised a return to the way things had been before the invasion. The squatters would be driven back into the Warrens, and those legitimate merchants and petty nobility who had been uprooted would be granted their old homes and lands as soon as they could prove their claims. The herald was greeted with hisses and jeers. "And how in the nine hells am I supposed to prove that I owned a smithy when the Queen burned it and my deeds to the ground?" one man yelled. Kyler would have been more sympathetic if he didn't recognize the man as a beggar. Others, however, joined a chorus of agreement. "I'm not going back," a young man yelled. "I lived in the Warrens long enough." "I killed 6 Paleys in the Nocta Himata," another shouted. "I deserve better." Before the crowd's fury gained more momentum, the herald beat a hasty retreat. Within an hour, scribes were openly hawking badly forged deeds. An hour after that, a Sakage representative showed up. His deeds were not only higher quality and much more expensive, he said the Sakage guaranteed that no duplicate deeds would be forged. He could only sell deeds for this neighborhood, and he had an allotment of what kind of shops could be representative. Thus, unless the owner still possessed the original deed, Sakage deeds were as good as gold. Within minutes, the non-Sakage scribes had been chased off or coerced to join. Meanwhile, food prices were skyrocketing. Tough loaves of bread that wouldn't sell for 6 coppers in the morning were selling for 10 after a full day hardening in the sun. As the sun set, people improvised wood frames with cloaks or blankets stretched over them to make lean-tos against the wall. Others wrapped themselves tight in their cloaks, tucked their purses inside their tunics, and slept where they lay, alone or in groups for warmth. Not everyone slept, of course. Darkness brought out the guild rats looking for easy bags. One even bent over Kyler, who hadn't moved in so long she thought him asleep. Kyler waited until the urchin, he couldn't even tell for sure under the grime, but he thought it was a girl, had a hand on his purse. Then he struck, spinning the child in his arms with both hands twisting behind her back, and Kyler's other hand locked around her throat. "Please, sir, I was up for a piss, and now I can't find Mada." Kids who have parents don't say piss when they talk to adults. "What guild are you?" "Guild, sir?" Kyler clouted her ear, but not as hard as Durza would have. "Black Dragon?" "Black Dragon," Kyler laughed softly. "That was my old guild. How much are dues these days?" 2 coppers. 2? We had to pay 4. Kyler felt like an old fart talking about how much harder things were when he was growing up. He let her go. "What's your name, kid?" "Blue." "Well, Blue, tell the tall kid not to try that fat man's purse. He's not asleep. If you all get out of here for an hour, I'll leave enough to pay your dues for a week. If you don't, I'll yell that I've caught a thief and tell everyone to watch out for guild rats, and you'll have to move on anyway, and you'll all be lucky to escape a beating." He let her go, and while she was gathering her crew, he went invisible and lifted the flagstone. Hidden doors set into the ground were never as secure as those set into walls. No matter how expertly constructed, once you opened a door in the ground, you displaced the dirt on the door as well as the dirt that inevitably got packed into the seams. But it would be the last time Kyler could use this safe house. A safe house you were afraid to use wasn't a safe house at all. But Kyler needed a noble's clothing, gold, and, thanks to the Kakari, new weapons. Instead of climbing down the ladder, he jumped and quickly pulled the flagstone shut. He checked for traps, one on the ladder and two on the door. All were intact. Then he opened the wood door slowly. The hinges protested, and he made a mental note to oil them. The tiny safe house was pristine, if stale. Kyler checked the top of one of the small chests. Across the latch was balanced a piece of his own hair. The hair, of course, wasn't a foolproof indicator of tampering. Even in a sealed safe house, your own entry could disturb the air enough to displace a hair. But if the hair was in place, it was unlikely that anyone else had entered. Kyler shook his head. He wasn't even planning to stay here more than a few minutes, but Durzo's habit of checking traps and examining every corner for threats had sunk deep. And where was Durzo? What had he been doing? Had he simply moved on to another life? Was it so easy for him to leave everything behind? The idea soured Kyler's mood. Durzo was a central figure in Kyler's life, and he'd abandoned him. Durzo had given him the Kakari, a treasure of untold worth, but he hadn't given Kyler his trust, or his time. A dusty glass case sat next to the dusty desk. Kyler opened the case. Inside, labeled in Durzo's neat hand, were dozens of jars of herbs, potions, elixirs, and tinctures. Durzo had told Kyler that some wet boys mislabeled their herbs deliberately, so as to confuse or kill anyone who stole from them. Durzo said anyone who had the resources and guts to steal from him could identify an herb or hire someone to do it for him. Kyler suspected the real reason was that Durzo couldn't bear to mislabel anything. That he wouldn't mislabel his supplies, however, didn't mean that Durzo did label all of them. Durzo believed that safe houses had a 1 in 4 chance of being discovered in any given year, so he spread the most valuable items of his collection out among them to minimize losses. Managing such an inventory was probably half the reason Kyler's master had been so paranoid. For in this now worthless safe house, in an unmarked vial smaller than Kyler's thumb, was a substance that looked like liquid gold. It had cost Durzo half a year and as much as a manse on Sidlin Way. Its proper name was Philodundamus. Durzo called it bottled fire. Whereas almost every other tool of the trade was mundane, if rarely known, bottled fire was magic. The only people who could make it were the Harani Aborigines, whose magic was tied to emotion and song. After being driven from their lowland homes 2 centuries ago, they hadn't had access to the materials they needed to make Philodundamus. How Durzo had known what those were, how he had gathered them, and how he had coached a Harani mage into making such a lethal substance, Kyler had no idea. Sitting at the desk, Kyler rooted around until he found the gold-plated tweezers, a wad of cotton, and a candle. Then he couldn't find a tinderbox. Since he could see in the dark, he never carried one anymore. Without a tinderbox, he couldn't light the candle. Without the candle, he couldn't clean the tweezers. Without clean tweezers, he couldn't pull off a wisp of cotton to dip into the bottled fire. Without the cotton, he couldn't test an appropriately tiny measure of the bottled fire. He swore under his breath. Why do you make things so hard? Use me, I'm sterile. You're telling me there's no little Kakari gravel out there? There was a pause, then unimpressed. And I thought Durzo's humor was lacking. Nonetheless, in a moment, the Kakari puddled in Kyler's palm and formed an instrument with a flexible bulb on one side that tapered down to almost a needlepoint on the other. Kyler had never seen anything like it before. Squeeze me and put me in the bottle. You're amazing, Kyler said. I know. Humble, too. Kyler opened the vial and sucked out a single drop. He dripped it onto a rag, closed the vial, and pushed his seat back. The Kakari dissolved back into his skin. Kyler put the vial of the bottled fire on the other side of the room and closed the herb case, only drawing out 1 vial of water. The gold drop of Philodundamus dried in moments, becoming hard and flaky. Kyler dropped the rag on the ground and dripped some water on it. The water wicked outward until it touched the Philodundamus. There was a whoosh of flame as high as Kyler's knee. The fire consumed the rag instantly and still burned for another 10 seconds, then guttered out. It's tricky, Durzo had said. Water, wine, blood, sweat. Most anything wet should trigger it, but it can get unstable. So by the night angels don't even open it if it's muggy. Kyler smiled as he tucked the vial away. Sweat. He'd pour the bottle on Tara Grayson's incestuous bed, if only such a death were public enough. He collected his clothing and gold, and turned to grab a sword from the weapons wall. Then something stopped him. You bastard, he said. Hanging on the wall, impossibly, as if Kyler hadn't sold it for a fortune in the city 2 weeks' ride away, was a big, beautiful sword with the word mercy etched on the blade. There was no explanation, no message of any kind, except for the smirk implicit in resetting Kyler's traps and replacing his single strand of hair. Durzo had redeemed Kyler's birthright. For a second time, Durzo was giving him retribution.